This is episode 13, Lexical and Auxiliary Verbs and their Similarities. So at this point, we should be comfortable with the idea that there are two types of verbs, lexical verbs and auxiliary verbs. And we looked at the differences between these verbs and then broke down auxiliary verbs a little further into primary and modal auxiliary verbs. So let's just do a quick review of the differences between auxiliary verbs and lexical verbs before we jump into our new information, which will be to explore their similarities. So this sheet is a summary of all the differences between the lexical and auxiliary verbs. Let's go through it together. It shows lexical verbs on one side and auxiliary verbs on the other. Their first difference is that lexical verbs are an open class word and auxiliary verbs are a closed word class. Their semantic meanings are also different. Lexical verbs are doing, being or having verbs, while auxiliary verbs either have a purely functional role or a functional role in telling us the likelihood of something happening. Syntactically, they are different too, because lexical verbs can stand alone, and there can only be one lexical verb per verb phrase. But auxiliary verbs have to precede a lexical verb, and there can be up to 4 of them in one verb phrase. Finally, morphologically, we know that auxiliary verbs can be truncated, whereas lexical verbs cannot. And lexical verbs can carry endings to change them from other word classes, such as eyes, which might change summary, noun, into summarize, verb, whereas auxiliary verbs, because they are a closed class, have no derivation. So they're the differences, and there's quite a few. Now, the one feature where verbs from both the lexical and auxiliary categories share commonality is that they can carry the 5 morphological conjugations that reflect time, person, and aspect. And you can see it in a table here that will represent the similar morphological features of verbs. Along the top, I have broken the verbs into lexical verbs that conjugate in a regular pattern, such as play. Right, play here. Then there's lexical verbs that conjugate in an irregular pattern, such as see. We have auxiliary verbs then that are broken into their primary auxiliary verb, which I've used dummy do as our representative word. And then the modal auxiliary, and I've chosen to use might. I've also written down the side here the 5 different ways that the grammatical forms can change morphologically in the verb. So we have the basic infinitive, which are these play, see, do and might. Then we have the third person singular, the simple past, the past participle and the gerund. So the third person singular, I play, you play, she plays, where she is the third person, and as well as he or it. And there's all these situations, there's an S that goes on to that. So let's see what happens. I see, you see, she sees. So yes, there's an S on that. I've got to put an S here, it's important. I do, you do, she does. So we have ES, I might, you might, she might. There is no change on that. Now let's look at the simple past. Today I play, yesterday I played. So there is the regular ED ending to represent the simple past. Today I see, yesterday I saw. So that changes the whole word. Today I do, yesterday I did. Today I might, yesterday I might. Again, there is no change in that auxiliary modal. No change again. So I might go for a drive today. Yesterday I might have gone for a drive, but no change. Okay, the past participle. So that's I have played basketball before. Now in our regular conjugation, we still keep the ED there in the past participle. Well, what about see and seen? So I have seen basketball before, yep. I have done basketball before, so that's done. Do becomes done. I have might become, but well, that just doesn't make any sense. So I think we'll just put another dash here because we can't use it in that situation. Finally, let's look at the gerund, or the ing form. I am playing. Yes, we can put the playing here, where we have ing. He is seeing. Yes, it's not commonly used, but it certainly makes sense. They are doing. Yep, that's okay. He is mighting. No, that can't be used again, so there is no ing form. Now, I'd just like to point out here that sometimes the gerund or the ing form of the verb is a noun, such as eating. Eating is his favourite pastime. So of course, like any word, you need to check its semantic, morphological and syntactic properties before you conclude that this gerund is acting as a verb. Now, I think theoretically it's called a gerund if it's acting as a noun, and the ing form if it's acting as a verb. But it's all right, but let's not worry too much about that at this point. Okay, so that's our table complete. Let's see what it shows us. What it shows us is that lexical verbs and auxiliary verbs both have these 5 morphological changes, but modal auxiliary verbs do not carry any of the inflections and can only be used in their basic infinitive form. So that's a pretty strong point. All verbs carry the same morphological changes except modal auxiliary verbs. And that's why I chose to put them all, or continue to choose to put them all in the same word class, because the morphological split between the verb is not between the lexical and auxiliary verbs, but rather between the primary auxiliary verbs and the modal auxiliary verbs. So now let's just look up here at the table again and investigate why I might have used might as my example and not will, because will is usually the fallback example of a modal. It seems to be the most commonly used. Now, the reason why I chose to use might is because I didn't want there to be any confusion about the word would. Many might argue that the past form of will is would, so let's just take a quick look at that. Consider the following sentences. I play in the park, indicating that you often play in the park. And yesterday I played in the park, giving a specific time that this event has occurred. The meaning has clearly not changed, just the time that the playing happened. Now let's look at will. I will play in the park today. Now, something you are looking forward to perhaps is a good play in the park. I would play in the park yesterday. Well, I don't think that even makes sense at all, so it's clearly not past tense. Or I would play in the park today. But this third sentence doesn't really feel complete. We could say I would play in the park today if I had the time. Would in these sentences isn't acting as a past form of will. Rather, it is actually changing the structure of the sentences completely. So no, would is not the past tense of will. And in fact, I'm going to take this a little further in a video soon that investigates the role of will and our assumption that will is future tense. Okay. So that's been a lot of information on verbs, and we're just about ready to move on to verb phrases. Before we do, however, our next video is a short summary of verbs, just checking how much we've understood and can apply with regards to lexical and auxiliary verbs. So until then, thanks for watching The Language Code.